Welcome back to Tales of Folklore and Coffee. This week, I've decided to go back to Celtic folklore and look at a tale of the undead. We'll get to see what the Scottish believed about monsters we've come to know as zombies in pop culture, and maybe even get a few chills while we're at it. Episode 9, The Corpse of MacPhail. Grief fell over the house like a cumbersome blanket of snow. The MacPhail household was at its lowest that anyone could remember. The Lady MacPhail wept, for she saw her husband leave this world that they'd lived together in since they could ever remember. Children, perhaps. His 3 sons and daughters and granddaughters wept as well. His body lay lifeless and at peace, while everybody was silent. That day felt like it would never end. When the doctors left, the undertaker replaced him, measuring the body for the burial. MacPhail's widow watched everything the undertaker did, making sure he wouldn't desecrate the body. Placing herbs upon the man's chest, he grasped a horseshoe and was going to lay it upon his forehead when MacPhail's widow stopped him. What do you think you're doing? Putting that pagan trinket upon him. A man of God, no less. She wrenched the horseshoe from the man's hand and threw it away. Madam, it's only for your family's safety, he assured her, though she would have none of it. I suspect you think he will come back to haunt us, like the old tales our ancestors told us when drunk and sacrificing people to their gods of stone and wood. She laughed. Your work here is done for the night. You may go. We will expect you in the morning. And with that, the man packed his things and left. Navy blue night fell over the house as the family readied themselves for the day to come. Weariness and sorrow plagued them, as their minds were tired and almost felt guilty for sleeping, but they did, taking the children and putting them to bed and blowing out the candlelights. The night was quiet for the most part, nothing but sounds of the outside wildlife, and sleeping came from the dead quiet house. MacPhail's widow stayed by his side the entire night, watching over him, holding his cold, lifeless hand in her own. For hours she did this, until she herself fell asleep. It wasn't till she was deep in her rest that she felt his hand grip back. Waking up from a blissful dream, she thought that somehow her husband had come back from the brink of death. And she was right. Though, not in the way she wanted. His eyes were glazed over, his skin a pale gray. His touch was as cold as before. Though, he was sitting up straight in bed. And he was reaching for her neck. Leaning forward, the monster that was before her was indeed not her late husband, but a beast. Of what kind she didn't know, and she didn't want to stay to find out. The woman screamed as she ran as fast as her feet could carry her. Slamming the door behind her, she could hear the monster rattling at the door frame, his fist pummeling the wooden barrier in an attempt to get to the widow. The scream had alerted the rest of the family, making their way to the room where they found their mother, and to some, grandmother, sitting on the ground dumbfounded. For a moment, they didn't know why, until the racket at the door started once again, seeming to not exchange words but only looks. They knew, and they knew what had happened. The family didn't sleep a wink that night, as they all stayed at the door, listening and watching the wood bow with some of the monster's hits. Just before the dawn was the worst, as they believed the door would fall and the monster would come for them. Though at the first sign of the sun, the monster fell with a dull thud and was no more. When the eldest son of MacPhail worked up the courage to open up the door, they found his lifeless body again, laying on the floor with battered fists and bloody knuckles. The story of the MacPhails was kind of hard to track down. There's not much mention of them anywhere besides this story that I'd originally read in a Celtic Myths book I found about 2 years ago. It was originally a Scottish tale, I would suppose, to warn people of messing with dead bodies or to enforce the belief of lucky talismans. This story was the first I'd ever seen of the living dead type in folklore. Now, mind you, there are many more, but at the time of reading this story, I had just started watching The Walking Dead, and I'd always had an immense appreciation for all things medieval, even if this was a story from the 1800s or perhaps a little earlier than that. Now, this is a story I think I've changed the most on this podcast. The story goes that an old man MacPhail died. He left a widow, a son, and his wife, as well as a granddaughter behind. When MacPhail died, his son rode off that day into town, looking to get preparations for the funeral done. That night, he stayed in town, leaving his wife, mother, and daughter in the house with his father's body in one of the rooms. The story goes that it was a full moon, and things always happened on a full moon in any type of folklore. The little girl was the first to see him, and everybody was rightfully so scared senseless after seeing their dead relative up and walking. When the door in the story was closed, it goes that the monster started digging into the floor to try and get to everybody. Although he almost succeeded, but the sun's rising stopped him and the monster's attack, leaving MacPhail's son to come back and wonder what had happened the night before. Personally, this is one of my favorite tales, like I say with most of my podcast episodes, although this story inspired a lot of one-shot stories that I've written and a book that I've been writing for a while as well. Thank you for listening. For those who watch on YouTube, thank you. You get the treat of seeing a hand-drawn and commissioned thumbnail, as well as directly engaging with me in the comments. Make sure to give this video a share and a like, as it really helps my name get out there and helps the community grow for this channel. This podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, Soundcloud, and of course, YouTube. The music in this podcast was The Ballad of Robin Hood by Logan Epic Canto, Beyond the Clouds by Filip Lackovic, and Melancholia by Ryan Creep.